The Germans have had to, especially because they killed their nuclear plants, they've had to turn back to coal. And so now they're burning way more coal than they used to for 5 times the electricity price and unreliable power to boot. And so this degrowth philosophy, which violates the presuppositions of economic motivation, let's say on a psychological and economic front, is not only going to demolish the industrial structure, make the poor much poorer and more desperate, but it's going to bring about worsening of the conditions for environmental sustainability, and very, very rapidly. Now, we're also seeing in Europe, and you can comment on this a bit, is that because we're now in an energy crisis, a foolish energy crisis, that people are starting to deforest Europe, and they're starting to burn peat in Ireland again because they have to heat their damn homes. So even by the standards of the environmentalists themselves, perverse though those standards may be, the degrowth philosophy is completely unsustainable politically and psychologically. Because you're just not going to tell people, you can let grandma freeze in the dark.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it's not going to happen. People are just not going to allow that. And they won't accept that sort of tyranny as you're talking about. You would need much, much more than anyone would be willing to offer up. Just to give you one sense of it, for the average American, some estimates indicate that going net zero would actually cost you in the order of $12,000 per person per year by 2050. That's just impossible to imagine that anyone would ever accept. And also, I think we need to separate. There's been this tendency in almost all conversation to totally muddle climate and environment. Now, environment is a lot of other things, and it's, for instance, air pollution and all these other things that are fairly, local to you. So degrowth would actually solve climate change because we would stop producing. It wouldn't solve a lot of the other environmental problems because now we would start, burning everything else, and we would be terribly poor, and life would be horrible in so many other ways. I think fundamentally we just need to get back to realizing that when you're saying, and these protesters will glue themselves to the roads and say, we don't want you to use any fossil fuels. But of course, when they come back in their lives, they're crucially dependent mostly on lots and lots of energy produced by fossil fuels. And they would probably, most of them, not be willing to give that up. And if they're not even willing to do that, of course they're not going to get anyone else to do that just by gluing themselves on highways. What they're going to do is if they could come up with a new innovation that was cleaner than anything else, if they, instead of gluing themselves to the road, would actually take up university, go and figure out, and it need not be a solution to climate change, but one of those solutions, but one that was actually effective, then of course they would have done real good in the world. And so again, I think that's the sort of purpose of our whole conversation, to say, stop believing this is the end of the world, because it's not, but also stop believing that the solution to the end of the world is to glue yourself or to just be gloomy or tell everyone we should just stop with everything. The solution is smart technologies.
The solution to the end of the world is not to become a frightened tyrant that says, oh my God, the sky is falling. I need all the power now. I need to make these centralized decisions. These centralized decisions are going to affect every single element of your life and your children's life, assuming you get to have children at all. And that's going to bring us towards a more benevolent planet. It's like, none of that's true. There's not an apocalypse. You don't get to be a frightened tyrant. We don't need centralized top-down control of absolutely everything we do. And even if we did have all of that, what we would get wouldn't be the positive outcome that everyone who's on that side is touting. What we'd get is the same kind of centralized planning disasters that we've seen play out time and time again over the last 100 years all over the world. This is, every single way you cut this is a bad set of solutions. Now, I want to steel man it a little bit. So, the idea that there are too many people on the planet is actually predicated on, you might say data, which is one of the weird things about data, is that if you take a petri dish that's full of a nutritive medium and you put a mold on it, The mold will grow until it eats all the available nutrients, and then it will all die. And so that's a kind of limits to growth model. But the world in that model is a encapsulated petri dish, and the biological agents are mindless single-celled organisms. So you might say, well, that's not a great metaphor for human beings, because first of all, human beings aren't mold or viruses or cancers. We're a very strange breed of creature, because we can think, and we can react, and we can modify the environment, and we can modify ourselves. And so it isn't obvious at all. People say, follow the science. The science is Malthusian. We're all, microorganisms in a petri dish, or rats in a colony. We're going to overpopulate till we devour everything. It's like, I don't think so. First of all, why would you use single-celled organisms as the cardinal metaphor for human populations? It's a preposterous biological metaphor. And one of the things the economists have pointed out, as opposed to the biologists, who tend to be more Malthusian repeatedly, is, look, you can create your linear models of what's going to happen if. But what you're failing to take into account is the proclivity of people to revolutionarily transform the way they interact with the world, and to continually figure out how to do more with less. And there's no indication whatsoever that we've run to the end of that process. Quite the contrary, we'd seem to be getting faster at it all the time. And there's no reason to assume that the limits to growth petri dish model of human catastrophe is the appropriate biological metaphor. That's not justified by science, and 99% of scientists don't believe it. And one of the things that's so interesting, you know this perfectly well, is that economists and biologists have been betting against each other really formally since the mid-60s. And the biologists, like, what's his name at Stanford, Paul Ehrlich, who's been screeching since the mid-60s about the fact that we're Malthusian organisms doomed to extinction. He's been wrong in every single one of his predictions, and publicly and massively, and I would say even murderously wrong in some fundamental sense. So he predicted that there would be way too many people on the planet by the year 2000. That was seriously wrong. He predicted that all of the prices of our commodities were going to spike through the roof as everything became more and more scarce, as there became more and more of us. That was 100% wrong. He had a famous bet with Julian Simon, and Simon collected, I think, just after the turn of the millennia, because Simon, the economist, claimed that, no, quite the contrary. As there are more people, there'll be more commodities, there'll be more resources, and the prices will fall. He even offered Ehrlich the opportunity to pick the basket of commodities they would bet on. And Ehrlich got stomped. And what we've seen continually, time and time again, is the economists have been right.